morning, everyone. So today's Monday morning for me. I sent my kids off to school a little while ago, and now I'm kind of shifting into teaching mode right now. So in this video, we're going to be talking about culture, and that's what we're going to be talking about this week. So in this first video, I'm just going to kind of go over what we're going to discuss in the other videos and also give us a few broad terms to think about. So I hope everyone's doing well. And again, if you have questions about anything, you can send me emails. We can set up time to talk as well. So, all right, so we'll just kind of jump into it then. Okay, so we're going to be talking about culture. So what does that mean? That's going to be a big question that we need to ask, that we need to think about. So start to think about what you think culture is. What kind of ideas come to your mind? Maybe some of the things on the side here give you some ideas. Maybe you think about operas or things like that when you think about culture. Maybe you think about pop culture and mass media. Maybe you think about specific practices that people do. So reflect on some of those things, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about a definition that we can work with for the class. Okay, so, all right, actually, okay. So in this class, we're going to be going over some things. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with some main definitions about what culture is and things like that in this video. And in the other videos, we're going to look at components of culture. So what are these big building blocks of culture, like symbols, language, values, and norms? And we'll be looking at some different examples of those. And it can be actually kind of a fun discussion. So we'll see what some of the things are that we come up with. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit about cultural diversity and kind of these kind of cultural clashes that develop. And then we'll start to apply some of the theories that we've been discussing last week, because we're going to keep building on some of the different theories as we go through the class. So one thing to note is we'll be focusing particularly on kind of macro approaches when we're discussing culture, whereas next week when we talk about socialization, we're going to switch more to a micro approach. So we'll be looking more at symbolic interactionism next week, but we'll be diving into some of the other theories today. So, all right, so that just is to give you a sense about what we're doing. So let's think about, again, culture. So what is culture? How can we give it just a definition? So maybe come up with your own idea here. This might be a good time to think about how you might define culture, and then we'll go into the definition. Okay, so culture is extremely broad. Basically, it's everything that's around us as we go through our lives. It is the physical items that we see and touch and become part of our identity. Things like clothing, computers, even just, and also practices. If we keep animals as pets, for example, ways that we cross the street, practices around going to school or going to work, the things that we eat, the things that we drink, all of these things. It's basically everything that we interact with in our lives. It's all part of our culture, part of the culture around us. So the textbook definition is that it's the sum total of the social environment in which we are raised and continue to be socialized through our lives. So we're looking at this idea again, if we go back to the sociological imagination, the sociological perspective, when we talk about seeing the strange in the familiar. So when we're talking about culture, we're trying to think about, well, what are all the things that we do that we never think about? And why do we do them? And that's kind of the starting place for talking about culture. So when anthropologists study culture, a lot of times they're going to another culture and they're looking at what are the rituals people do around this. They would travel to these other countries and they observe them as strangers. But within sociology, we want to think in particular, and anthropologists do this too, but to think about what are the things that are just kind of part of our lives, and can we examine them? Can we kind of unpack them and think about what they mean? So the material elements of culture are, you know, the physical things themselves, the mug that you drink your coffee out of, the pen and pencil or the computer that you're using right now, or the phone that you're using, these kinds of things. But we're also talking about the non-material elements. We're talking about values, we're talking about norms, we're talking about ideas that are connected to the things that we have. So if we talk, we're going to be talking particularly about Canadian identity too, although a lot of us might have connections to other cultures around the world too. But when we think about Canadian identity, we can start to think about, are there particular values around specific ideas in Canadian culture? So one of the big ones sometimes people think about is something like Tim Hortons, or at least that was something, maybe that's kind of shifting now, but this idea of going to Tim Hortons and getting your coffee and your donuts and so you can try to think about, well, are there some particular values that we associate with specific items that we think of as being particularly Canadian or particularly significant in some way? So that's something to kind of think about a little bit. But to give us an example, let's think about back to school. And let's think about kids going back to school. And we'll think about this in terms of material and then non-material elements. So you can think about how usually there's going to be a back to school kind of supply list, a list of things that you need to bring with you. So what do you think some of those things would be? Maybe just write down for a minute, start to come up with a list of items that you think would be typically expected for a student to bring. And yeah, like think about what kind of things that they might have in their backpack over the semester, what kind of things that they might have with them. Okay, so let's move on for a second and let's think about this some more. So first of all, they're probably going to put their things in a backpack. And when we look at backpacks, if you look at these two here, for example, do you have an idea that one backpack is meant for somebody and another backpack is meant for someone else? Are there kind of typical kind of girl versus boy backpacks that we find when we go and we look in the stores and we're choosing out a backpack for our kids, or maybe we think back to our experience when we're going to school ourselves? Did we tend to think this is the proper backpack for me to have, and people might have a different reaction if I use this other backpack? So that's one thing. So that's a physical item, but it also is connected to our ideas around gender. Okay. So we can also go on and we can think about it a little bit more. So another thing that is typically going to end up in a child's backpack is an agenda that says, this is how we need to divide our time. We need to do this project by this day, and the parents are expected to interact and sign the agenda and things like that, right? And so it's expected that there should be a schedule, that there should be certain things done at certain times in certain places, and there's this whole kind of process around that. So there's these ideas that even around time and how we should value our lives and how productive we should be that get associated in there too. And we can think about other things, and maybe you're thinking about some other examples too. Something that I think is actually interesting that we can talk about particularly this year is when it comes to kind of COVID-19, it's changed about what we kind of expect kids to take to school with them. There's new things that have been added. This idea of wearing masks, for example, in a lot of schools within Saskatchewan and in other places. Grade 4 and up students are expected to be wearing masks, so that's a new thing that needs to be included. And there's a lot of different values and ideas associated around masks right now too. And we can talk about that. Some people see them as an oppression of freedom. Sometimes people see them as a health service that we can provide for ourselves and for others. So you get a lot of ideas kind of wrapped up in there. And also hand sanitizer is another one too. And this idea of cleanliness and keeping our germs away from others and all of that. And so the interesting thing when we talk about COVID-19 and we talk about culture is it gives us a reminder that things are changing, that culture is not something that's always fixed and certain, that we know what to expect. So if you imagine just for a moment that you weren't in the world, maybe you were traveling in space for the last year, and you are just coming to Canada now and you're seeing these different things. You're seeing people wearing masks and you're seeing these different practices. You're seeing signs and symbols saying, go this direction and not that direction. Make sure you have 6 feet between you and others, all of that kind of stuff. That it would be kind of jarring to you. And maybe you still find it jarring when you see these things now, because it is something new and different as part of our culture. And it's something that we're seeing in lots of other cultures as well too. But it shows that it's something that we kind of adjust to, that they become part of our lives over time, and we kind of settle in to ideas around them and the different values that they're associated with. All right. So we can even think about another example. We can think about food items. Okay, so this is one that I found about 5 years ago. I found this example, but I like this example because it makes you think about the implications of culture when it comes to these material items like food. So this was a comparison about kind of school foods that are offered in different places. So this was a typical kind of American meal that students might be offered for their lunches. So we have nachos covered in cheese. We've got fries, chocolate milk, ketchup. I think there might be juice in the cup as well there. Okay, so you have that stuff on the American side. And then on the French side, you have all these different healthy items. You have different vegetables and kind of these items that might be seen as kind of like fancier meal ideas. And then you think about, well, if these are the typical kind of meals that students might eat in one place or another, what kind of cultural effects does this have? Is one much healthier than the other? And what might the long-term kind of ramifications of certain ways of eating have on people's lives and as they grow? So it's just an interesting comparison because it raises the point that the cultures we grow up in are going to shape our relationship with food and shape our long-term ideas around health. All right, so the next thing that we want to come up with a way of understanding here is this idea of society. Okay, so we're talking about culture, we're talking about Canadian culture in particular today. We're talking about this idea that people kind of share a culture, that there might be certain things that we have in common as we are within Canada, that there might be certain things that we tend to really kind of connect to and see it as something that we share, whether that is particular practices around food, so also like in terms of that, sometimes we talk about Canadian foods like poutine, although it gets controversial in some ways because the things that we think of as being Canadian identity, there may be more specific to certain areas of Canada. But there is this idea that there is such a thing as Canadian culture and that there's a way we can define it. And it's a thing that Canadians would tend to share, right? I think we can all agree about that. But we're going to be talking more about what those components might be and maybe some of the controversial aspects of that. So the idea of society is that it is people who share a culture and live in some kind of defined territory. So Canada has its boundaries. And of course, you can see how these things can change over time too, as boundaries might shift and change between nations. But so we have this idea that there's a specific Canadian culture, a specific group of people that share this culture, and that that's true across many other cultures and places. So those are sort of the main things I wanted to touch on in the first video, so we have a way of thinking about this. So basically, what we're talking about is extremely broad, about as broad as you can be in anything today, because we're talking about culture, which is basically everything around us. It's including even things like practices around how people maintain their livelihoods. Do they farm? Do they plant gardens? All of these things, that it's all part of culture, and that we all are part of a society. So we're people that share a culture. But we'll be talking a bit, as I mentioned, about some of the controversial aspects of this too. All right, so that'll be the end of this video, and then we're going to move on to start talking about some of the components of culture.